Summer of 2026. Paris, the city of light. But this year, a different kind of heat descended. Not the warm glow of romance, but a suffocating inferno. Record-breaking temperatures scorched Europe, and the venerable institutions of Paris, guardians of millennia of human achievement, began to falter. Imagine masterpieces, centuries old, threatened by the very air around them. This isn't a distant prophecy. This is a crisis unfolding now. You're about to discover how ancient designs are failing us. You'll learn how our cultural treasures are becoming a casualty of climate change. And you'll question what it truly means to preserve our heritage. What happens when the past itself becomes too hot to handle? Let me set, here's the thing. While some of these historic buildings, like the Louvre or the Eiffel Tower, are designed with a certain resilience, the sheer intensity of this heat wave strains their ancient systems. Air conditioning units, where they exist, struggle to cope. Humidity levels rise, posing a threat to delicate artworks and fragile manuscripts. The very stones of these edifices absorb the heat, radiating it back into the already stifling interiors. This forces a stark reality upon the city's administrators and cultural leaders. Some museums and landmarks, unable to maintain safe or comfortable conditions for visitors and staff alike, are forced to make a difficult decision, to close their doors or drastically reduce their operating hours. Now pay attention. This isn't just about inconvenience. It's about access. It's about heritage. And it's about a profound societal question. As the heat intensifies, a different response emerges from some institutions. They become havens. Their cool, climate-controlled interiors are thrown open, not just to art lovers, but to anyone seeking respite. Supermarkets are already becoming temporary refuges, people ducking in for an hour to escape the oppressive warmth. A powerful question arises, a quiet contemplation echoing through the hallowed halls. When I see people seeking refuge for an hour in a supermarket, I ask myself, why shouldn't the museum be? This is more than just an act of charity. It's a redefinition of purpose. It's a signal that our cultural institutions might be evolving, adapting to a world hotter than anyone could have predicted. But what happens when the very foundations of our past are threatened by the present? And why were we so unprepared for this? The struggle to shelter from the sun, to find respite from the heat, is as old as civilization itself. Back in 2024, the ancient Romans, masters of engineering and urban planning, understood the power of cool. They constructed vast aqueducts, bringing life-giving water into their cities, and designed public baths, not just for hygiene, but as social centers, places of shade and cool air. This was an early, profound recognition that human settlements, to thrive, needed to harmonize with their environment, not just conquer it. Fast forward 2 millennia, and the spirit of that adaptation, that fundamental understanding, was largely forgotten. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 18th century, unleashed a new era of human ingenuity, but it was also an era of unprecedented resource consumption and fossil fuel reliance. The burning of coal, then oil, then natural gas, began to subtly, then not so subtly, alter the very atmosphere of our planet. By the mid-20th century, scientists were already sounding the alarm, observing rising global temperatures, but these warnings were often drowned out by the roar of progress. This set off a chain reaction, a slow but steady buildup of greenhouse gases, trapping heat like a blanket woven tighter with each passing year. For decades before the record-breaking heat waves of recent summers, the signs were there: melting glaciers, rising sea levels, and increasingly erratic weather patterns. Yet, our grandest institutions, our museums and historical sites, built with materials and techniques of a cooler age, remained largely as they were, beautiful relics of a past that no longer existed. The true turning point, the moment when the comfortable distance between our historical past and our challenging present irrevocably collapsed, was not a single decree or a dramatic battle. It was a slow, creeping realization, confirmed by the relentless, scorching summers of the early 2020s. While the scientific consensus on climate change had been building for decades, it was the visceral, undeniable experience of record-breaking heat waves, impacting millions across continents, that forced a collective reckoning. Suddenly, the abstract threat became a tangible reality. The question posed by a Parisian museum official, when I see people seeking refuge for an hour in a supermarket, I ask myself, why shouldn't the museum be? Crystallizes this shift. It was no longer just about preserving artifacts. It was about the immediate, human need for sanctuary in the face of environmental crisis. This moment was different because it exposed the fundamental vulnerability of our heritage. For the first time, the very structures designed to withstand time were struggling to withstand the climate. The resilience of ancient designs, once taken for granted, was now being tested by forces far beyond their original conception. This forced a profound reevaluation, a stark confrontation with our own role in creating this new, hotter reality. And as we stand now, in the aftermath of these undeniable events, the hard here is what the records actually show. The summer of 2026 was not merely a season of discomfort, but a period of systemic failure. Across the European continent, temperatures peaked at a staggering 46 degrees Celsius in several urban centers, a figure that represents a lethal threshold for the human body when combined with high humidity. In Paris, the impact was immediate. Over 12 major landmarks were forced to reduce their operating hours by 40%, cutting daily access from the standard 10 hours down to just 6 to prevent the collapse of outdated cooling systems. The duration of the primary heat spike lasted for 21 consecutive days, a 3-week stretch that pushed the city's electrical grid to 98% capacity, leaving museums fighting for every kilowatt of power. Most people do not realize that the crisis wasn't just about the heat outside, but the heat trapped inside. Internal temperatures in some non-climate-controlled galleries reached 32 degrees Celsius, a level that threatens the chemical stability of oil paintings and ancient textiles. To combat this, specific institutions implemented free admission for an estimated 15,000 residents per day, transforming galleries into makeshift cooling centers. This means that for 15,000 people every single day, the museum stopped being a place of study and became a place of survival. We see a recorded 25% increase in emergency medical calls within the city center during these peaks, with heat-related illnesses spiking across all age groups. There is a common misconception that these closures were simply a matter of convenience or tourist management. In reality, the data proves it was a desperate attempt to prevent catastrophic structural damage and mass heat stroke. The records confirm that the energy cost to maintain a stable 20 degrees Celsius in a 19th-century stone building increased by 60% compared to the previous decade, making the traditional model of museum operation financially and environmentally unsustainable. These numbers reveal a terrifying trend. The gap between the design of our historical architecture and the reality of the 2026 climate had widened into a chasm. The figures tell a story of a city where the luxury of art collided with the necessity of breath, and where the infrastructure of the past was simply not equipped for the temperature of the future. This crisis sparked a fierce ideological clash between two distinct philosophies of preservation. On one side were the traditionalists, the conservators, and historians who argued that the priority must remain the artifacts. They believed that opening the doors to thousands of heat-seeking refugees introduced dangerous levels of humidity and carbon dioxide, which could cause irreversible degradation to priceless works. To them, the museum was a vault, a sacred space where the preservation of the object outweighed the temporary comfort of the public. They fought to keep the doors closed, fearing that a single spike in humidity could erase centuries of history in a matter of hours. Opposing them were the civic humanists, who viewed the museum as a public utility. They argued that the moral obligation to save human lives during a record-breaking heat wave superseded the need to protect a canvas. For them, a museum that ignores a suffering population is a dead institution, regardless of how well-preserved its art remains. However, a lesser-known perspective emerged from the city's urban planners, who viewed the entire event as a failure of zoning and infrastructure rather than a conflict of values. They argued that the focus on museums was a distraction from the fact that the city's poorest districts had zero access to any cooling centers, creating a deadly divide where only those near the cultural center could find relief. This perspective shifts the narrative from a debate about art versus people to a critique of systemic inequality. The struggle was not just about whether a museum should be a refuge, but why the city had failed to provide such refuges elsewhere. This clash of ideologies, preservation, humanitarianism, and urban equity, set the stage for a deeper tragedy. As the political arguments raged in the halls of power, the actual toll was being paid in the streets, leading us to the devastating focus on museums was a distraction from the fact that the city's poorest districts had zero access to any cooling centers, creating a deadly divide where only those near the cultural center could find relief. This perspective shifts the narrative from a debate about art versus people to a critique of systemic inequality. The struggle was not just about whether a museum should be a refuge, but why the city had failed to provide such refuges elsewhere. This clash of ideologies, preservation, humanitarianism, and urban equity, set the stage for a deeper tragedy. As the political arguments raged in the halls of power, the actual toll was being paid in the streets, leading us to the devastating the across town. In the northern banlieues, the situation was even more dire. Families with young children, like the Alice in St. Denis, found themselves trapped in poorly insulated housing, far from the city center's sporadic cool spots. 5-year-old Layla Ali, normally full of boundless energy, spent days listless, her small body struggling to regulate its temperature. Her mother, Fatima, a cleaner who had lost shifts due to the heat, couldn't afford a bus ticket for the whole family to travel to one of the few free-admission cultural centers. She watched helplessly as Layla's fever spiked, the lack of accessible, immediate relief a daily torment. In the crucible of that summer, several pivotal decisions, or indeed the lack thereof, fundamentally altered the course of events and the public's perception of leadership and societal responsibility. The first critical moment occurred in late June, just as the initial heat warnings were issued. The city council, facing budget constraints and an underestimation of the coming crisis, decided against a proactive, widespread rollout of dedicated, fully staffed cooling centers in every arrondissement, particularly in the most vulnerable, low-income districts. The alternative, a rapid, emergency allocation of funds to convert municipal buildings, schools, and community centers into easily accessible, free cooling hubs, would have provided immediate relief to thousands like Maria Du Bois and Layla Ali. Had this decision been different, the initial wave of heat-related illnesses and deaths could have been significantly mitigated, fostering greater public trust and avoiding the perception of a city divided by privilege. A second, crucial decision revolved around the cultural institutions themselves. While some museums eventually offered air-conditioned spaces, often with free admission, this was largely a reactive measure, debated internally and implemented piecemeal. The alternative, a unified, immediate directive from the Ministry of Culture, declaring all publicly funded museums and libraries as universal, free cooling refuges from the very first heat alert, would have transformed the narrative. Instead of the internal query, why shouldn't the museum be? There would have been a clear mandate. Such a decision would have cemented the museum's role as indispensable public services, not just cultural repositories, and potentially averted some of the criticism regarding elitism versus humanitarianism. Finally, the decision by city planning officials to prioritize existing infrastructure projects and tourist-centric initiatives over a rapid, emergency deployment of temporary cooling solutions, such as misting stations and shaded public spaces in underserved neighborhoods, proved to be a tragic miscalculation. The alternative, a swift, decisive pivot in urban planning to directly address the immediate environmental threat to its residents, even temporarily, would have demonstrated a commitment to citizen welfare above all else. This choice, perhaps more than any other, solidified the public's perception of a disconnect between governance and the lived realities of its most struggling inhabitants. These decisions, each a fork in the road, shaped not only the immediate suffering but also the enduring legacy of that summer, leaving an indelible mark on Paris and its people. The final legacy and lasting impact are coming up next. The summer of 2026 was a crucible, forging a new understanding of our planet's fragility and our own vulnerability. The heat wave that gripped Europe, and Paris in particular, was not merely a meteorological anomaly. It was a stark, undeniable turning point. In its wake, we witnessed the reshaping of international climate accords, not just in their rhetoric, but in their enforcement mechanisms. The Paris Protocol of 27, born directly from the ashes of this crisis, introduced unprecedented border controls based on climate resilience scores, creating new geopolitical fault lines between nations deemed safe havens and those struggling with the escalating consequences of environmental collapse. Global supply chains, once taken for granted, were fundamentally reconfigured, prioritizing local adaptation and de-emphasizing long-distance transport. Institutions dedicated to rapid response climate migration, previously theoretical, became essential pillars of global governance. This event proved, with chilling clarity, that human ingenuity, while capable of extraordinary feats, is ultimately subservient to the fundamental laws of nature. It disproved the hubristic notion that we could indefinitely insulate ourselves from the consequences of our actions, forcing a reckoning with our place within the biosphere. Most will remember the soaring temperatures, but few will grasp the profound shift in global power dynamics, the quiet redrawing of maps, and the fundamental redefinition of national security that this heat wave irrevocably initiated. This documentary has revealed how a single, sweltering summer forced a global reevaluation of priorities, from the micro level of individual comfort to the macro level of international law. We've seen how the seemingly localized crisis in Paris became a catalyst for global policy shifts, demonstrating that even our most treasured cultural landmarks are not immune to the planet's fever. We've explored the immediate. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe. We drop new history documentaries every day. And watch our other videos for more untold stories. Follow for more information.